My name is Sid Ramin, Sidney Ramin, but known as Sid Ramin, and I was born and grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. And I hesitate to say this, but it was January the 22nd, 1919. And that was a long time ago, and that's why I'm a little reluctant to tell you, but the fact is that it was 1919. My parents were both musical, and my father played the violin, not professionally, just as a hobby. He played the violin, my mother played the piano, and again, not professionally, just as a hobby. But I did hear music and loved it, and whatever musical talent I finally ended up with, I assume I owe to them. The first memory I have of creating music, I can practically pinpoint it. I was 12 years old when I met a young fellow who was 5 months older than I am, or I was, and his name was Leonard Bernstein. And we became very, very friendly. And I was 12 and he was 12, 5 months difference. We became inseparable. And we remained friends for 70, 80 years, however that was. But at that point, we created little songs together. And I suppose they were very, very infantile, obviously, but they were creative songs, and we sang them together, and we criticized each other's songs, and that was my first. I don't consider myself to be a composer, though. I must hasten to tell you that. I am an orchestrator. I'm an arranger. And the difference between an arranger and an orchestrator is up for discussion also. Most people don't know what an orchestrator does. An orchestrator today is used mostly in its generic form. You orchestrate a political campaign, or you orchestrate a scheme to do something, or you orchestrate a plan. But the true orchestrator is somebody who picks an instrument in the orchestra and assigns the notes to that instrument. That's what an orchestrator does. And most people overlook that. The first year of my Army service was in Boston, and I was on an island, Fort Andrews, in Boston. My second through fifth year of the Army was with the 84th Infantry, and I was in headquarters, and I wrote music for shows, and I formed the orchestra, and I conducted the orchestra, and it was four of the happiest years of my life, even though I went to Europe with them, and I did walk guard at night, looking over my shoulder, wondering whether I was going to be popped off. But those 5 years in the Army, I wouldn't swap those 5 years for anything. I enjoyed it immensely, and it prepared me for civilian life as far as what I wanted to do, and that was be an arranger. I have to confess something that maybe it's hard to really confess. I honestly have never had any training in orchestration, except that I was friendly with Leonard Bernstein to the point where we used to look at scores, and we would talk about the scores, and I would learn that way. And Lenny had his own system of his own musical theory system, and I sort of adopted it. But I guess if there was a rough and tumble way of learning to orchestrate, that's how I learned. I learned with a captive orchestra in service. And I sort of was interested in the range of instruments. I would want to make sure that notes were playable on various instruments. But that was easy. You just ask the player, can you know, for the ranges, and try to remember them. And as far as mixtures go, that was the fun of arranging. You just try different things, and you voiced different combinations. And that's how I learned my craft. And I don't say this disparagingly, but I think that I probably learned as much on my own in doing that, probably more, than with a teacher of orchestration. Nothing like the practical aspects of it, I think.
A moment ago you mentioned Leonard Bernstein's private method of music theory. And just in case this is probably not written down in a book anywhere, are there any aspects of that which you, for the sake of posterity, that you might want to comment on?
When Lenny went to Harvard, he was a year older than I am as far as going to school. I knew that I wanted to continue studying with him and learning and learning what he had to think about music. So I said, Lenny, I want to visit you at Harvard, and I don't want to do it for nothing. I will pay you $1 a lesson and a candy bar, and I'll have my weekly lesson with you. And he said, okay. Now Lenny had his own system. He would call a dominant seventh chord a finishing chord, because a dominant leads to the tonic, and a finishing chord leads to the end. And a subdominant he would call a sub-finishing chord. He had his own names, but they served the same purpose. A dominant seventh still went to the tonic, but Lenny called it a finishing chord to the tonic. And so I used his terminology for a long time, and I used to love to bring him a Three Musketeers candy bar, which he loved, and his $1, and I did that for quite a few years when he was at Harvard.
That's really interesting, the idea of finishing chord, because it certainly, to use that sort of terminology, creates a much more narrative concept of music than, say, dominant or subdominant. Do you think, is it an accurate reflection of the sort of theatrical nature of his music?
No, I just think it's a pragmatic approach. I just think that the dominant chord is a finishing chord, and a subdominant chord is a pre-finishing chord.